Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Instant Insights podcast. At GlobalData Strategic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm your host, Aidan Knight, and today I'm joined by two of our macro and geopolitical experts from TS.Lombard, Elizabeth Johnson and Grace Pham. We will discuss the Donroe Doctrine, Trump's recent moves from Venezuela to Greenland, and what it means for global geopolitics. Elizabeth is the Managing Director of Brazil Research, and Grace is the head of Global Policy and Disruptive Themes Research at TS.Lombard. Just for reference, this episode was recorded on the 12th of February 2026. Let me start with Grace. What is the Donroe Doctrine, which I gather is Trump's version of the Monroe Doctrine? For our listeners, I should mention that the Monroe Doctrine is a famous foreign policy directive issued by US President James Monroe 2 centuries ago, warning Europe to stay out of America's backyard of the Western Hemisphere.
Thanks, Aidan. As we all know, the president is a big proponent of both branding and self-branding, so the Donroe Doctrine is right up his alley. It's also a catchier phrase than its formal title, which is the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as released in the US's National Security Strategy last December. And in specific, Trump's version says that the US will reassert American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere above the Middle East and Asia, as well as deny quote unquote non-hemispheric rivals the ability to position forces or to control strategically vital assets in the region, or words to that effect. Now, these documents are often written and forgotten about, even by the very administration that puts them together. But in this case, the Trump corollary was unveiled just a few weeks before Trump's capture of Venezuelan strongman Nicolas Maduro, which immediately gave it more resonance, not least to LATAM countries. So to put that in context, in a couple polls taken shortly afterwards, a majority of LATAM respondents said they thought or feared the US government could stage a similar military raid in their countries under similar premises. This includes Colombia, Panama, Brazil, Mexico, some of the exact targets of Trump's big stick since he came back to power. I should also mention that the Trump corollary, aka the Donroe Doctrine, has been unveiled at a time when LATAM has been seeing a really strong push by China into the region, both when it comes to trade. So, for example, think of all those Chinese cars and EVs pouring to the region, and solar, wind, you name it, as well as infrastructure and military to military ties. So, as a case in point, at the start of Trump 1, there were no LATAM countries in China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now there are over 20 countries in the program.
Just to focus on something you mentioned earlier, you mentioned Trump's capture of Venezuelan strongman Nicolas Maduro. How does that relate to the Greenland situation, if at all?
So let me take that in parts. Today, the situation in Venezuela is very fluid, still explosive, and highly uncertain as to whether the interim government can last the full year and beyond. That means that the jury is out on whether Trump's Maduro capture is a success or failure, and history will be the judge of this, 3, 5, 10 years out. The metric we're thinking about this is whether Venezuela returns to becoming a stable and even flourishing democracy or remains under repressive and autocratic rule. What's also clear, too, is that Trump's move presents a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the US to enact real change in the region. So again, in recent polls, 6 out of 10 Latin Americans approved of Trump's Venezuela gambit, in a sign of just how fed up they are with the current status quo. And that includes rising crime rates, the net immigration outflows spearheaded by the Venezuelan exodus over the past decade, 1/4 of the population leaving, or around 8 million people. So turning to Greenland and looking at it purely from a national security lens, it's very clear that melting ice from climate change opens up new Arctic sea lanes that Russia and China could use and dominate. By one count, average Arctic sea ice has dropped more than 25% in the past 5 years versus the average for the 3 decades to 2010. So this could nearly halve the sea route from East Asia to Western Europe to around 20 days. And then, of course, there are also critical minerals on Greenland. And in fact, it ranks in the top 10 in the world for rare earth reserves, at number 8, according to the US Geological Survey. So, of course, the cost to extract them is exorbitant today because there are no roads and no supporting infrastructure. So, in many ways, Greenland is not unlike Venezuela about current potential, it is about future potential and future dangers over the coming decade and decades ahead. Now, what ties the two together, Venezuela and Greenland, is two things. First, a refocus on US national security in the region, which is a change from America's relative neglect of its quote unquote backyard over the past 2 decades. And second, and of course, far more polarizing, is Trump's expansionist vision, which he talked about in his inaugural address and off and on since then, specifically invoking, for example, manifest destiny and territorial expansion. Now, whether or not this stays rhetorical is up in the air, but after the Maduro capture and after all his comments about potentially invading Greenland, many countries are reassessing the costs and benefits of doing business with both China and the US.
Thank you for that, Grace. Elizabeth, let's come to you. How have other parts of South America reacted at the removal of Maduro?
Thanks for your question, Aidan. Well, as Grace mentioned, this has prompted concern across the region about which country will be the next target. Here in Brazil, I think there was a big sigh of relief when Trump didn't move towards more aggressive regime change. And in fact, Maduro did not have a lot of allies across the region. Since the stolen election, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of Brazil had kept Maduro at arm's length, had really tried to disassociate himself and his government from the Maduro regime. Of course, in part because we have a presidential election coming up here in Brazil later this year, and also in other parts of Latin America, including Colombia. And associating with Maduro is not electorally popular. But I think in some ways it was the best outcome for the Lula administration. For example, they immediately recognized Delcy Rodriguez as the leader. They've offered to work as an intermediary with the Trump administration and Venezuela. And ultimately, if Trump's little gambit in Venezuela fails, Lula can basically say, well, you live with the results of your actions. So really, we had some concern that potential military action on the continent would be bad for Brazil, for Brazilian assets, and basically the entire operation was really just brushed off.
Yeah, speaking of Trump's gambit, what does his endorsement of Delcy Rodriguez mean for the future of Venezuela?
Well, I think that really remains to be seen. I think there has been some progress, the release of political prisoners, but getting Venezuelan oil back to the market in significant volumes will take billions and billions of dollars and will take time. Um, but ultimately, I think this decision really gave him the positive optics of having Maduro out of power without some aggressive boots on the ground operation, which we know would not be popular among Trump's base in the US.
Sure, and just circling back, you mentioned Brazil and the broader question about South America. In theory, when Trump's planning, I mean, we don't know how specifically, but to attract investment from for oil operations in Venezuela, how would an increase in Venezuelan oil output affect Brazil?
Well, obviously, we're in a moment of relatively low oil prices, and increased output is going to hurt all oil producers. But I think Brazil, over the past 30 years, has really demonstrated that it is a safe place to invest. We haven't seen rule changes. We haven't seen the nationalization of resources like we've seen in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Argentina. So Brazil has really successfully shown to be a reliable, steady place to invest. And we see international oil companies continuing to bet on Brazilian oil and gas production. Um, and the country remains on track to becoming the fifth largest oil exporter by the end of this decade.
Well, perfect. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask this question to both of you now. What do you think the next focus is for Trump in Latin America?
I can kick off. So Trump has specifically called out Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico after the Maduro capture. And now we know very quickly that Colombian President Gustavo Petro just met with Trump in the White House earlier this month in a positive encounter, and that Colombia is having presidential elections next quarter. So it appears that both sides have concluded that a détente makes sense, at least until after the elections. Trump would also be wise not to intervene, or he could produce an anti-Trump bump that favors the left in the election, as he did in Australia, Canada, and Brazil, for that matter. As for Cuba, it's firmly in Trump's crosshairs, with Marco Rubio, the US's first Latino Secretary of State, ideologically committed to regime change there. The Trump plan for now appears to be to economically asphyxiate Cuba by blockading and potentially tariffing oil exports to the island, with the hope of regime change by the end of this year. Now, Cuba has surprised the US in the past with its ability to survive all manner of sanctions and other blows. But similar to Iran, it is at its weakest moment in decades. And the Trump administration has a real shot here of ushering in change. And then finally, on my part, Mexico is the most vulnerable of the major LATAM countries to Trump as a result of its heavy dependence on US trade, with over 80% of its exports going to the US, and the USMCA talks also underway ahead of their mid-year review. So Trump is, of course, saber rattling because Mexico is the main source of fentanyl going into the US. And there are several high profile narco politicians linked to President Sheinbaum's ruling Morena party as well, up to and including her mentor, former President AMLO. So Sheinbaum is really on the hot seat, and this means that the risk of US military incursions to Mexican territory without prior sovereign consent is quite high, especially as Trump may want to have a made for social media moment ahead of the midterm elections. But at the same time, the World Cup does represent, which is being hosted by North America in June and July, does represent a chance for the region to pull together. And of course, the US affordability crisis could aid Mexico as Trump might eventually decide it's in his best interests to dial down the pressure ahead of the midterms, including lowering some tariffs and who knows, even green lighting the USMCA after playing hardball.
Thanks, Grace. Elizabeth, any thoughts?
Well, I think the key issue from Brazil's perspective, from President Lula's perspective, is that he hopes that the Trump administration will not get involved in the October election. So we've seen Trump influencing elections across the region, helping Argentine President Javier Milei in his midterm election, also in Central America. And I think Lula's primary goal in his dealings with Trump is to really help guarantee that Trump maintains relatively neutral in those elections.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Grace, let's turn to China. You know, Latin America is a massive trading partner with China, both in import and export. And you know, China was very involved in the Venezuelan economy before Trump took over. How do you think Beijing will react?
There is no question that the Donroe Doctrine is both a huge challenge and setback to China's long term game plan in the region. Beijing was predictably outraged by the Maduro capture, as well as embarrassed, given that a special Chinese envoy was in town to meet with Maduro just hours before the US military extracted him. So, at the same time, Venezuelan oil only accounts for around 4 or 5% of China's oil imports. So it's not a major economic blow, despite Venezuela still owing, as you mentioned, billions to China from past loans, at least 10 billion, some think 20 billion. And of course, Trump is willing to sell Venezuelan oil to the Chinese if at market prices and not the deeply discounted prices the independent Chinese teapot refiners were getting when they were purchasing US sanctioned oil. The bigger deal, I would say, has been Panama's recent Supreme Court ruling that handed the Trump administration a huge win when the court struck down the port terminal concession owned by Hong Kong firm CK Hutchinson. Now, Beijing does not want this to be repeated in the future, and it will revamp its playbook accordingly to ratchet up the pain and punish any offending countries and firms that attempt to do something similar, up to and including the US itself. At the same time, if it's too heavy handed, it runs the risk of shooting itself in the foot, as it did with its October rare earth export controls that were placed on the entire world and which spooked both rich countries and countries in the global south. So while there is a lot of uncertainty ahead and projects will get caught in the crossfire between the two superpowers, I can also envision a scenario ahead in which more carrots, not sticks, from both China and the US can be given to regional countries to the benefit of middle powers, including Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Peru.
Thanks for that, Grace. Elizabeth, let's bring it back to Brazil. We know Lula is already treading on thin ice with Trump, given the situation with Bolsonaro. Sorry, just to explain to our listeners. In September, the Supreme Federal Court of Brazil sentenced Bolsonaro to 27 years over a coup plot after the election of Lula, and he was arrested in November. How will this affect the relationship between Brasilia and Washington?
That's a great question. Um, Really, we've seen since last July when Trump imposed the additional tariffs on Brazil over Bolsonaro, we've seen a slow and steady improvement in the relationship between Trump and Lula. So the two met briefly last year on the sidelines of the UN and then again in Malaysia. And following that meeting in Malaysia, Trump announced that he was rolling back some of the tariffs. Of course, as Grace mentioned, affordability is a key concern for Trump. And I think he and his close allies recognized that the damage that those tariffs were doing to US consumers was much higher than it was to Brazilian exporters. So at the end of the day, those tariffs were rolled back at the end of November. And now the two leaders are scheduled to meet in early March in in Washington. So this will be Lula's first visit to the U.S. to meet with Trump. And this is really an opportunity for the two leaders to try and make some progress on additional trade and investment deals. So I think a lot of people think of Lula as a ideological leftist, but I think at the end of the day, he has a lot in common with Trump in terms of his political pragmatism. And I think people also don't realize how open Brazil is to foreign investment. So uh, Trump is eager to attract investment to Brazil, be it European, Chinese, uh, South African, uh, Indonesian investment. That is Lula's top priority. And we believe that there is opportunity for Trump and Lula to make progress on critical mineral supply. Brazil's the second largest has the second largest rare earths deposits in the world, and we've seen significant progress toward developing those resources. But Brazil doesn't want to be a mere supplier of the raw materials of the commodities. So Lula is very interested in attracting more downstream investment to Brazil. And that's something that he and Trump could potentially agree upon. And I think, getting back to what Grace was talking about earlier about Trump's vision for the Western Hemisphere, it's important to note that without Brazil, that strategy will be quite difficult to advance. So I'm cautiously optimistic that the two leaders will find some middle ground to strengthen their relationship in the coming months following this meeting between the two leaders in Washington.
Sure, sure. You've also been working on a lot of coverage of Brazil's upcoming elections. How will this all play into the elections coming up later this year?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Lula and his team are very concerned about potential interference in the election, be it through social media posts or some sort of support of the opposition candidate, who at this point it appears that former President Jair Bolsonaro's son, Flavio, is the leading opposition candidate. So Lula definitely wants to keep Trump close and avoid having Trump endorse Flavio or another opposition candidate. So far, that appears to be working. Flavio was in Washington earlier this year and was unable to meet with members of the U.S. administration. And in some ways, we've seen Trump distance himself from Bolsonaro and the Bolsonaro clan over the last 6 months. So this is clearly an issue. But our view really is that Lula is the favorite going into the election. Brazil, like the US, is very polarized, but Lula has the advantage of being the incumbent, and he's passed a series of very uh, popular reforms that he's hoping will help him get across the finish line this October and be elected to a fourth term.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Finally, turning back to you, Grace, what does the future hold for the Donroe Doctrine? How much of this will be enduring after Trump leaves office and if a Democratic administration follows?
That's a great question. The simple answer is a reversion to the mean in some ways. For example, no more threats on NATO territories, no more threats on NATO allies on invading their territories, and a return to some continuity among the changes that Trump has initiated. But it's also a useful reminder that under the Biden administration, top Pentagon generals, for example, the then head of the Southern Command, Laura Richardson, kept warning that the US was being outcompeted in the region by China, be it in deep water ports, space, satellite listening stations, 5G, you name it. In fact, back in 2023, she mentioned that China was on the quote unquote 20-yard line in the red zone to the US homeland. And since then, Chinese smart cities and smart port tech and AI has only gotten better. So it is a legitimate concern, not only for the US, but LATAM countries, that if war were to break out in the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea between the two superpowers, their countries could be drawn in and become battlegrounds. So I would say it's a fair bet that when it comes to strategic assets, a Democratic president would likely continue the same policies, similar to the way that Biden continued Trump's tariffs and tech war against China when he took over. At the same time, for all the extremely fraught and negative repercussions of the Donroe Doctrine, the Americas have a big opportunity going forward. And here I would echo Elizabeth's cautious optimism, looking out over the next 5, 10, 20 years, that the Western Hemisphere has this horizon in which reshoring, reindustrialization, friendshoring really comes to the fore and comes to fruition. And this is largely because of the militarization of East Asia, the epicenter of semiconductor technology and production today, as well as more military tensions in the wider Indo-Pacific region.
Well, that's great, Grace. Thank you so much. And thank you both of you for all of the insights you've given here today. Um, you can find out more about our reports and the Intelligence Center in the episode description below. And thank you everyone for listening. And from us in Strategic Intelligence, see you next time.